nomads of the windswept steppe, transformed into architects of empire. This is the extraordinary saga of the Seljuks. From humble origins among the Oghuz tribes, these Turkic warriors swept across Central Asia and Persia, reshaping the Islamic world through conquest and cultural fusion. Under leaders like Tughril Beg and Alp Arslan, they revitalized the Abbasid Caliphate, shattered Byzantine dominance at Manzikert, and built an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the Oxus. Though eventually broken by Mongol invasion, their legacy endured through exquisite architecture, innovative administration, and the blending of Turkish vigor with Persian refinement, creating foundations upon which later empires would build for centuries. Across the endless sweep of grass between the Aral and the Caspian seas, the wind carried the scent of smoke and salt. Herds moved like drifting clouds, following the seasons across a land that belonged to no single ruler. Before the rise of empires, this was a world governed by rhythm rather than law. The gallop of hooves, the crack of ice in spring, the flare of campfires beneath an open sky. Far to the north of the Persian frontier, the Oghuz Confederation bound together many Turkic tribes under a loose authority. Their lives were measured by migration, winter along the Sir Daria, summer across the rolling plateaus beyond. Banners marked each clan, colored with wolves, suns, or soaring hawks. The Yabgu, Lord of Lords, ruled from a moving court of tents where justice was spoken beside the smoke of roasting meat. His power depended not on walls or treasuries, but on the loyalty of those who followed him from one horizon to the next. These tribes lived by the bow and the herd. Children learned to ride before they could walk, and a warrior's worth was judged by the straightness of his arrow flight. At night, shamans traced runes in the ashes and invoked Tengri, the eternal blue sky, to guide the fate of men. Yet change was already seeping into the steppe. From the south came traders, wrapped in linen and perfumed oils, carrying tales of a single god and the prophet who had united half the known world. With them rode mullahs and scholars who spoke of scripture and law, of a discipline stronger than kinship. Among the countless tents of the Oghuz lived a man named Seljuk, son of Dukak. He was born into the Kinik clan, famed for its stubborn pride and readiness for battle. In his youth, he served the Yabgu as a commander of horsemen, defending the caravan routes that wound toward Khwarezm. Seasons of victory and feasting passed, yet ambition stirred in him. When the overlord demanded more tribute than custom allowed, Seljuk refused. His defiance was not simply rebellion, but an act of faith in his own destiny. Conflict followed. Blood feuds spread through the encampments, and kin turned their spears upon one another. Rather than drown his people in civil war, Seljuk gathered his followers and rode eastward across the Sir Daria. The journey was perilous. Sandstorms scoured their faces, rivers swallowed wagons, and hunger stalked their herds. What survived of that march became legend. It was said that where the hooves of their horses fell, the grass never grew again, so deep were the ruts of their passage. Beyond the river lay Transoxiana, a land of walled cities and cultivated fields. Here, Islam had already taken root in the marketplaces of Bukhara and Samarkand, where scholars debated beneath tiled domes. To the nomads, these places shimmered like mirages of wealth and permanence. The Seljuks pitched their tents near the frontier, watching the flow of merchants and pilgrims with wary fascination. Contact brought work. The rulers of the region, heirs of the Samanid dynasty, often required mercenaries to patrol their borders or raid their enemies. The steppe riders, unmatched in speed and endurance, became their hired blades. Through service, Seljuk learned the patterns of empire, taxation, prayer, ceremony, and discovered that conquest of cities required not only courage, but comprehension. Gradually, his people began to absorb the faith and manners of those they fought beside. Conversion followed not as an instant revelation, but as a long persuasion. The old gods of wind and wolf offered freedom, but no unity. Islam promised a law that could bind men of every tongue under one heaven. Seljuk accepted this faith publicly, and his sons followed him. Mosques appeared in their encampments, their minarets slender and pale against the vastness of the plains. Arabic words began to mingle with Turkic speech, while the shaman's chants faded into memory. The clan's prayers now rose toward Mecca, not the stars. Despite this transformation, they remained nomads at heart. Their strength lay in motion, and their horizon was measured in days of riding. The Seljuks continued to raid and trade, drifting along the arteries that linked the Muslim and steppe worlds. At times they allied with the Samanids or the Karakhanids. At others, they turned upon them, plundering outposts and vanishing into the desert. Each victory drew new followers from distant tribes. The camp of Seljuk expanded until its fires dotted the plain like a constellation mirrored upon earth. By the closing years of the 10th century, his sons, Mikhail, Arslan, Musa, and Yunus, commanded loyal war bands who could muster thousands of riders. They wore mail taken from Persian armories and carried banners woven with Quranic verses. Yet around their necks still hung the bone talismans of their ancestors. They were neither fully settled nor fully nomad, a people standing between two worlds, learning to wield both. Seljuk himself aged in the saddle, his beard white as frost. He no longer led every raid, but his word carried more weight than any sword. His followers called him father of the tribe, and his counsel shaped their destiny. In the stories retold by later generations, he foresaw the empire his grandsons would build. Whether or not he uttered those prophecies, the result proved him right. When death came to him around the turn of the 11th century, the clan mourned beside the Oxus. They buried him beneath a mound facing south, toward the lands he had dreamed of. The funeral rites blended two faiths, the old offerings of milk and horsehair, and the recitation of verses from the Quran. Above his grave, the steppe wind sighed through the grass, a sound that seemed both farewell and promise. In the seasons that followed, his descendants gathered the herds and prepared to move again. They rode not as exiles now, but as claimants to a destiny that stretched far beyond the frontier. The name Seljuk ceased to belong to one man. It became the banner of an awakening power. From the shores of the Aral to the gardens of Khwarazm, the rumor of that name began to spread. Whispered in bazaars, feared by border garrisons, carried by merchants who had seen their speed and discipline. Out of the wandering tents of the Oghuz world, a new force was forming, one that would soon test itself against the sultans of the east and the caliphs of the west. And on the edge of those vast plains, two young men, grandsons of the old chieftain, watched the herds move beneath the reddening sky. Around them the horizon curved without end, a reminder that their inheritance was not land, but movement. Beyond that horizon lay Khorasan, Persia, and the first walls they would ever claim as their own. The age of the steppe was giving birth to an empire, and its heartbeat quickened with the thunder of hooves across the grass. The first light of morning crept across the sands of Khorasan and found two brothers already mounted. Their camp was little more than a scatter of tents and embers, yet the men gathered around them spoke of destiny as though it were a companion at the fire. They were Tugril Beg and Chagri Beg, grandsons of Seljuk the exile, men born to a life without cities who would soon claim cities of their own. The wind that whistled through their horsehair banners still carried the scent of the steppe, but ahead lay a different horizon, the walls of empire. Far from these tents, the once mighty Ghaznavid Empire stretched across Persia and Afghanistan. Its rulers sat on thrones carved from jade and spoke in the cultured tongue of poets, but their grip on the east was weakening. They were conquerors grown heavy with wealth, masters of marble palaces, who now looked uneasily toward the frontier, where nomads gathered like storm clouds. For years, Turkic mercenaries had filled their armies. Now those same horsemen were beginning to act in their own name. In the decade after Seljuk's death, his descendants had multiplied and hardened. The clan's camps sprawled across the oases of Transoxiana and along the Oxus, where they raided for pasture and plunder. Among the brothers, Tugril possessed the mind of a strategist. Calm and deliberate, Chagri carried the heat of the steppe, impulsive yet loyal. Their followers called them the twin falcons of the tribe. Under their leadership, the Seljuks became more than a wandering host. They became an army. Their rise began in the dust-choked valleys that bordered Khorasan, a land fought over by Samanids, Karakhanids, and Ghaznavids alike. When the Samanids collapsed under foreign invasion, Tugril moved quickly, seizing their grazing lands and swearing nominal allegiance to no one. For a time, he courted the favor of the Ghaznavid Sultan Masood I, offering service in exchange for recognition. But peace between steppe and city seldom lasted. The Ghaznavids treated the Seljuks as tools, useful but expendable. When demands for tribute returned, the brothers chose defiance. What followed was a campaign of endurance rather than glory. Masood's armies pursued them through the deserts of Merv and Nishapur, their armored cavalry ill-suited to the empty plains. The Seljuks retreated by choice, drawing their enemies deeper, striking at supply lines, burning water wells, and vanishing into the salt flats. Every encounter tested the difference between the nomad and the settled soldier. One lived with the land, the other depended on it. In 1038, the brothers gathered their tribes near the ruins of Serax. It was here that they first proclaimed independence, raising a green standard above their camp. To their followers, it was not simply a banner, but a declaration that the age of service was over. They began to forge a new order, blending the mobile tactics of the steppe with the administrative habits learned from Persian secretaries who had drifted into their orbit. Chroniclers later noted that scribes, merchants, and even jurists began to appear among their retinue, the earliest hints of a state taking shape within the framework of a tribe. Masood could not ignore such insolence. In 1040, he gathered a massive host at the oasis of Dandanakan, determined to crush the rebels once and for all. He marched from the rich cities of the south into a wasteland that swallowed armies whole. The Seljuks waited, harassing the columns, destroying wells, and allowing the desert to fight on their side. When the Ghaznavid troops finally reached the waterless plain, thirst and exhaustion had already broken their ranks. At the hour before dawn, the steppe riders struck. From 3 directions, they poured down like a tide of iron, arrows hissing through the morning haze. Masood's heavy cavalry tried to rally, but their formation collapsed in the sand. Within hours, the Ghaznavid camp was overrun, its treasure seized, its banners trampled. The victory at Dandanakan was total. What began as a revolt ended as the birth of a new power, the Seljuk Sultanate of Khorasan. In the aftermath, Tugril entered Nishapur to the sound of drums and recitation. Here, for the first time, he acted not as a chieftain, but as a ruler. Edicts were issued in his name, and coins were struck bearing the title Commander of the Faithful's Guardian. Mosques invoked his name in prayer alongside that of the Abbasid Caliph, though the Caliph had yet to meet him. Tughril appointed Persian administrators to manage taxation and supply, a recognition that the steppe alone could not sustain what he intended to build. The raw freedom of his ancestors was tempered by the order of the city. For the warriors who had followed him from the plains, this transformation was bewildering. They now stood guard at gates instead of open horizons, and their horses paced restlessly in courtyards paved with stone. But Tughril understood that empire required patience. The Persian scribes would manage the ledgers. The Turks would master the sword. Together, they would form something neither had known before. By the time envoys arrived from distant courts, the brothers ruled a domain that stretched from the Oxus to the mountains of Herat. Caravans bearing silks from China and spices from India now paid tribute to the Seljuks, and scholars began to write of them as arbiters of peace rather than raiders. Still, the memory of the steppe lingered in their hearts. Each year, Tughril left the city for the open plain, where he could breathe the cold air of his youth and watch the herds move like rivers of bronze. The fall of Dandanakan sent ripples through the Islamic world. To some, it signaled the end of Ghaznavid arrogance. To others, the return of a purer, martial faith. In the markets of Baghdad, merchants whispered of a new dynasty rising in the east, one that claimed to fight for both order and belief. The Abbasid Caliph, hemmed in by Shia Buyids and rival emirs, listened with cautious hope. Perhaps these Turks of Khorasan could become allies, defenders of the Caliphate's fading authority, while intrigue and expectation gathered in distant capitals. The brothers were already planning their next move. The deserts that had once sheltered them now lay behind, and beyond the mountains stretched the heart of Iran, fragmented and rich. Tughril's scribes marked routes toward Ray and Isfahan, the twin prizes of the Persian plateau. Chagri trained new regiments of mounted archers, transforming tribal levies into disciplined soldiers. Every arrow that left their bows seemed to trace the outline of an empire yet to be drawn. In the dust of Khorasan, the last traces of the Ghaznavid banners rotted away. What replaced them was not yet the grandeur of later centuries, but the promise of it. A new kind of power had taken root, one born of the steppe, but destined to rule from the city. The brothers had shown that the horizon could be conquered, and in the echo of their triumphs, other rulers began to tremble. As the sun set over the broken fortresses of the desert, Tughril stood at the edge of his camp, watching the light fade from the mountains. Behind him, the songs of victory carried into the night, mingled with the low hum of the muezzin's call. Before him lay Persia, the Caliphate, and the untested burden of sovereignty. The Nomads had found their kingdom, and soon the cities of the east would learn the rhythm of the steppe. The dust of Dandanakan had barely settled when the echoes of that victory began to reshape the map of the east. What had started as a tribal revolt now demanded to become a government. Tughril Beg ruled from Nishapur, yet his ambition pressed far beyond the city's sun-baked walls. He had no palace worthy of an emperor, no dynasty older than his own memory. But what he possessed mattered more: momentum. Every tribe that had once drifted freely across the steppe now looked toward Khorasan for command. Across Persia, the old powers trembled. The Buyid princes, Shia lords who had ruled in the Caliph's name for nearly a century, clung to their cities through intrigue and tribute. The Abbasid Caliph al-Qaim, still confined in Baghdad under their watchful eyes, survived only through ceremony. Between the fractured rulers of Iran and the silent Caliph of Iraq stretched a vacuum, and the Seljuks were already moving to fill it. From Nishapur, Tughrul's banners advanced westward like the sweep of a storm. The first to fall was Ray, the city of scholars and merchants. Its citizens opened their gates rather than face the spears of the Nomads, and Tughrul entered as a conqueror who promised stability. Markets reopened under his protection, and sermons in the mosques named him the Sultan of Khorasan, a title both practical and prophetic. To the Persian secretaries who filled his chancery, he was the first step toward a new order. To the Turkmen soldiers in his ranks, he remained a brother of the steppe. Each conquest brought a lesson. The Seljuks learned how to garrison cities, how to levy taxes without destroying trade, how to employ men who wrote instead of rode. Tughrul relied increasingly on Persian administrators, men who could translate the raw force of the steppes into the careful language of bureaucracy. Among them rose al-Kunduri, the first of many viziers who would define the machinery of Seljuk government. He built the institutions that transformed a nomadic confederation into a state: mint houses for coinage, offices for land grants, records for tribute. In the margins of those new ledgers, a nomad's dream hardened into empire. Beyond Ray lay Isfahan, a jewel of gardens and domes. Tughrul approached it not as a raider, but as a ruler in waiting. His scouts surrounded the city, cutting off its water and supply lines. But when the gates opened, he forbade looting. To the citizens, this discipline felt like a revelation. The conquerors who rode in under his banners did not plunder. They governed. In Isfahan's courtyards, Arabic and Persian scholars debated theology under Seljuk protection, each astonished that a Turkic chieftain might safeguard learning rather than extinguish it. While Persia bowed, the wider Islamic world watched. Messengers reached Baghdad, describing Tughrul's victories and the order he had imposed across the east. For Caliph al-Qaim, such tidings carried both hope and risk. The Abbasid throne still glittered in name, but its shadow had long since faded. Shia Buyids dictated its policies, collecting taxes in its name and placing their banners above its gates. A Sunni revival led by armed nomads might either rescue the caliphate or erase it entirely. In 1054, the Sultan set his eyes on Iraq. The march west was deliberate, each step calculated to project legitimacy. Before entering the caliph's domains, Tughrul wrote to al-Qaim, declaring himself a defender of the Sunni order and a servant of the rightful imam. His armies advanced through Hamadan and Qazvin, meeting little resistance. Persian nobles who had once served the Buyids now changed allegiance without battle. The Seljuk tide seemed unstoppable. Baghdad awaited, divided and anxious. The city that had once ruled the world now lay strangled by its own guards, its people caught between rival emirs and unpaid mercenaries. In the autumn of 1055, Tughrul's vanguard reached the Tigris. Chroniclers speak of panic in the streets. Some feared a barbarian invasion, others prayed for deliverance. When the Sultan's troops entered, they did so under banners of peace. No plunder followed, only proclamations. The Buyid officers who refused submission were expelled. The rest were pardoned. For the first time in generations, the caliph emerged from behind palace walls to greet a protector rather than a captor. On a raised platform before the congregational mosque, the two figures met. The aging heir of the Abbasids, frail but regal, and the lean Turkic warrior whose name had become synonymous with destiny. The ceremony bound sword and sermon together once more. By the caliph's decree, Tughril Beg was named Sultan of the East and West, commander of all who fought for the faith. That recognition transformed everything. The nomadic chieftain, who had once fled the Sir Daria, now stood as guardian of Islam's heartland. Persian scholars praised him as the restorer of order. Arab chroniclers hailed him as the hand of divine justice. In every mosque from Nishapur to Baghdad, the Friday prayer carried his name alongside that of the caliph. The empire had found not only legitimacy, but purpose. Yet power carried its own unease. Tukrul knew that conquest won loyalty only so long as the treasure flowed. His realm stretched from the Oxus to the Euphrates, but the threads that held it together were fragile. Personal allegiance, marriage alliances, and the promise of plunder. Tribal chiefs murmured for reward. Cities demanded protection. Persian bureaucrats maneuvered for influence. The Sultan, once free as wind, now ruled through the delicate balance of men whose languages and customs were not his own. In the palaces of Baghdad, the courtiers whispered of transformation. The steppe had entered the city, and the city had entered the steppe. Turkic guards stood beside Persian scribes. Nomad horsemen bowed before scholars of law. What emerged was neither purely Eastern nor Western, but something altogether new. A Seljuk synthesis that fused conquest with administration, fervor with reason. As spring came to Khorasan once more, Tugril left the capital to inspect his lands. He travelled lightly, as if unwilling to abandon the habits of his youth. From the saddle, he watched the caravans winding along the revived trade roads, the fortresses rising from the desert, the green fields returning to life under his protection. To those who greeted him, he appeared not as a conqueror, but as a force of restoration. Where others had ruled by fear, he ruled by movement, never still, never satisfied, always pressing toward the next horizon. The sun dipped behind the western hills as the Sultan's entourage returned to camp. Fires flared against the darkening sky, their smoke merging with the desert stars. Beyond those flames lay the lands still untouched by his command. The mountains of Armenia, the Byzantine frontiers, the cities of Syria. The empire was young, and its borders had yet to harden. But in that moment, Baghdad slept under the protection of the Seljuks, and the caliph's voice carried once more across a united faith. Tukril had bound the fractured world of Islam into uneasy unity, held together by the will of one man who had learned to turn exile into power. His triumph would not last forever. No empire's dawn ever does. But it had begun with a nomad's vision of order. And somewhere beyond the Euphrates, new battles already waited beneath the same endless sky. When Tugril Beg died, the empire he had forged stretched farther than any of his people could have imagined. From the deserts of Khwarazm to the gardens of Baghdad. Yet power without succession is a fragile edifice. In the wake of his death, intrigue flickered through the palaces of the East like hidden fire. Nobles whispered, governors plotted, and distant generals weighed loyalty against ambition. From that uncertainty rose a new figure. Younger, sharper, and destined to carry the Seljuk name beyond the known frontier. Alp Arslan, the heroic lion, was the son of Chagri Beg, an heir to the warrior's inheritance. He was no wanderer like his grandfather, nor a builder like his uncle. He stood between the two, a ruler born of the steppe yet tempered by the city. When he claimed the throne in 1063, he inherited an empire not yet at peace. Rival cousins challenged his authority, restive tribes tested his patience, and the caliph in Baghdad still watched cautiously from his court. But Alp Arslan possessed something that neither politics nor pedigree could supply: momentum carried by conviction. His early reign began not with conquest, but with consolidation. In Khorasan, he tightened the reins of command. rewarding the loyal and exiling the disobedient. At his side stood a man whose intellect would define the age, Nizam al-Mulk, the vizier whose vision transformed tribal rule into imperial structure. Where Tughril had relied on borrowed administrators, Nizam created institutions that would endure. He systematized taxation, standardized weights and measures, and founded a network of Nizamiya schools, places where jurists, theologians, and philosophers trained under the banner of Sunni orthodoxy. Through those schools, the Seljuks became more than conquerors. They became patrons of knowledge and faith. While scholars debated in Isfahan, soldiers drilled in the plains of Azerbaijan. Alp Arslan saw the empire's future not in palaces, but in expansion. The western horizon called to him, the frontier where Muslim lands touched the Byzantine Empire, a realm ancient and glittering, yet weakened by internal strife. For centuries, the borderlands of Armenia and Anatolia had been a corridor of raids and reprisals. Now they would become a theater of destiny. Before turning west, the Sultan secured his rear. He subdued revolts in the Caspian provinces, reaffirmed alliances with vassal princes, and placed members of his family in key fortresses. His methods were direct, but rarely cruel. Chroniclers noted that he preferred negotiation to destruction, seeing diplomacy as a faster road to obedience. Even his enemies admitted that his rule brought stability where chaos had reigned. By the late 1060s, Seljuk banners fluttered along the Euphrates. The Sultan's armies moved like rivers of iron, lean and relentless, commanded by veterans who had fought under Tughril. Their strategy was shaped by the steppe: avoid fixed battles, exploit mobility, strike supply lines, and let hunger do the work of the sword. The Byzantines, heirs of Rome's discipline, struggled to adapt. Their heavy armor and rigid formations withered under clouds of arrows that vanished before retaliation. Still, the empire to the west was not to be dismissed. The Byzantine emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, sought to restore imperial dignity by driving the Turks back across the mountains. In 1071, he gathered a vast army, drawn from every corner of his dominion: Greeks, Armenians, Franks, and Normans, and marched eastward. Alp Arslan, meanwhile, had been campaigning in Syria, securing Aleppo and Damascus from local warlords. The news of Romanos's advance reached him on the march. To most rulers, the situation would have demanded retreat. To Alp Arslan, it offered revelation. He turned north with astonishing speed, crossing deserts and mountain passes that others considered impassable. Scouts harried the Byzantine columns, denying them rest and food. The two forces met near the small fortress of Manzikert, surrounded by volcanic ridges and dry valleys. The place was unremarkable, yet within its dust lay the pivot of two worlds. On the morning of battle, the Seljuk army appeared light and scattered, each regiment wheeling in arcs across the plain. Their banners streamed like flame against the sky. The Byzantines, confident in their numbers, advanced in heavy ranks. As the day lengthened, Alp Arslan's forces feigned retreat, drawing their foes into pursuit. When the imperial lines stretched thin and confusion spread, the Turks wheeled and struck from all sides. Arrows darkened the sun, and the roar of hooves drowned the commands of Romanos's officers. By dusk, the Byzantine army had collapsed. Romanos was captured, a moment so improbable that even the victors could scarcely believe it. Alp Arslan treated the emperor not as a trophy, but as a guest. He offered him water, spoke with calm dignity, and agreed to terms that demanded no humiliation. It was an act of chivalry rare in that brutal age, and it spread his fame farther than any victory could. The consequences of Manzikert were immense. The Byzantine frontier disintegrated, garrisons deserted, the great plateau of Anatolia lay open. Waves of Turkic tribes poured through the mountain passes, seeking land and fortune. Many settled, founding new towns and emirates that bore the Seljuk name. The empire had not planned this colonization, yet it transformed the map. The highlands of Asia Minor, once Roman and Christian, began to echo with Turkic speech and the call to prayer. While settlers carved new homes from the frontier, Alp Arslan turned his attention back to administration. He appointed his son, Malik Shah, as heir, ensuring a smooth succession that would avoid the turmoil that followed Tughrel's death. Under the guidance of Nizam al-Mulk, he envisioned a realm that would last beyond the strength of any single ruler. A state guided by law, supported by education, and anchored in faith. But fate remained unpredictable, as it always did for men who lived by the sword. In 1072, while campaigning in Transoxiana against a rebellious governor, Alp Arslan confronted a fortress that refused to yield. During parley, a captive struck him with a hidden dagger. The wound proved fatal. The Sultan died within days, murmuring prayers for his son's success. His body was carried to Merv, where the scholars and soldiers of the empire gathered to honor him. There, beneath the turquoise domes he had restored, they buried him beside his father. The Nomads wept for the warrior who had opened the gates of the West. The scholars mourned the patron who had made their learning a state's foundation. The death of Alp Arslan marked the end of conquest's first breath, and the beginning of consolidation's long labor. His victories had changed the balance of the Islamic world, binding the steppes to the cities, faith to governance, and war to civilization. In the wake of Manzikert, new horizons beckoned, and his heir, Malik Shah, would take up the task of turning triumph into peace. The empire that Alp Arslan left behind was vast but restless, a tapestry woven from victory and uncertainty. Into this inheritance stepped his son, Malik Shah, a ruler barely in his 20s, whose youth might have undone a lesser man. Yet within months, he proved himself more than a fortunate heir. He possessed his father's courage, his grandfather's patience, and beside him, the sharpest mind of the age. Nizam al-Mulk, the vizier who had already turned the raw sinew of conquest into the framework of a state. Together, they would raise the Seljuk realm to its highest point, a dominion stretching from the Hindu Kush to the Aegean coast, from the Oxus to the borders of Arabia. Malik Shah's first years were marked by balance, not the uneasy calm of survival, but the deliberate poise of mastery. He moved his court to Isfahan, a city reborn under Seljuk rule, where gardens and canals mirrored the harmony of administration. In its bazaars, Persian merchants sold goods from India, China, and Byzantium. In its libraries, scholars compiled treatises that would outlast empires. The Sultan walked among them, not as a distant sovereign, but as a patron of learning. Under his reign, the Seljuks ceased to be mere conquerors. They became stewards of civilization. Nizam al-Mulk's genius found its fullest expression in these years. The Ikta system, which granted lands to soldiers in lieu of payment, ensured that the army was both rewarded and bound to the state. Provincial governors, once semi-independent warlords, now answered to a bureaucracy whose precision impressed even their enemies. Tax registers were rewritten, roads patrolled, and caravanserais maintained. The empire's lifeblood, trade, flowed unimpeded through these arteries of order. Faith underpinned this structure. To strengthen Sunni orthodoxy, Nizam founded the Nizamiya madrasas, schools that drew the best minds of the Islamic world. In Baghdad, Nishapur, and Balkh, Students gathered under vaulted halls to study theology, law, and philosophy. Among their teachers was Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, whose writings would define Islamic thought for centuries. Through these institutions, the Seljuks became defenders of Sunni unity at a time when sectarian divides threatened to fragment the faith. Malik Shah understood the symbolism of this achievement. The caliph in Baghdad, once a prisoner of circumstance, now blessed the sultan as the protector of Islam's temporal order. In return, the Seljuks guarded the caliphate's dignity even as they wielded true power. It was a delicate equilibrium, sword and scripture held in the same hand. The empire's mosques echoed with sermons praising the young ruler as a just monarch whose justice extended even to those who opposed him. Isfahan, under his rule, became a beacon of refinement. Its avenues were lined with plane trees, its palaces inlaid with turquoise and gold. The court attracted astronomers, poets, and architects. From this circle emerged Omar Khayyam, the mathematician and poet who devised the Jalali calendar, so precise that later astronomers would model theirs upon it. Nights in the observatory blended science and devotion. Men charted the heavens not to challenge the divine, but to admire its design. Beyond the city, the empire's frontiers pulsed with vitality. In the east, governors in Khorasan maintained uneasy peace with the rising Karakhanids. In the west, Anatolia bloomed under the Sultanate of Rum, a branch of the Seljuk family that had taken root after Manzikert. Their victories and settlements turned the plateau into a new homeland for Turkic peoples, transforming Byzantine provinces into Muslim lands in less than a generation. Within this prosperity, however, the first fissures appeared. The same network of princes that once secured the empire now threatened to divide it. Malik Shah's brothers and cousins ruled semi-autonomous regions, Kavurd in Kirman, Tutush in Syria, Barkiyaruk in the heartlands. Loyalty in such a vast realm was measured less by obedience than by ambition deferred. Yet Malik Shah managed them with deft diplomacy, reminding them that unity was their shared inheritance. Even so, shadows gathered beyond the borders of reason. In the mountains of northern Iran, the Nizari Ismailis, known later as the Assassins, carved fortresses into the rock. Their leader, Hassan-i-Sabah, proclaimed a rival vision of Islam, one ruled not by kings but by imams hidden from the world. Their daggers found targets in the markets of Ray and the palaces of Isfahan, striking fear out of proportion to their numbers. Malik Shah responded with caution rather than cruelty, understanding that ideas could not be killed by swords alone. The Sultan's reign embodied a rare balance between power and peace. His campaigns were swift and decisive, his governance measured and just. Under his command, caravans crossed the deserts safely, pilgrims reached Mecca unmolested, and cities once ruined by war flourished again. Chroniclers recorded that a woman could travel from the Oxus to Damascus, wearing gold without fear of theft. A legend, perhaps, but one that captured the sense of security his rule inspired. For 2 decades, the Seljuk Empire shone like the noon sun over the Islamic world. It absorbed the cultures it touched, blending Turkic vigor with Persian elegance and Arab learning. The Sultan's decrees were read in 3 languages. His coinage bore inscriptions in Arabic and Persian, framed by Turkic motifs. This fusion of traditions became the Seljuk hallmark, the seed from which later empires, including the Ottomans, would grow. Even so, beneath the calm, fate prepared its turn. In 1092, Malik Shah fell ill while traveling near Baghdad. Some said poison, others exhaustion. No one knew for certain. He was 37. Nizam al-Mulk had been assassinated only weeks earlier by an agent of the Ismailis. and their deaths in such quick succession felt like the unraveling of a perfect tapestry. Within months, the machinery they had built began to slow, then falter. Governors hesitated, princes quarreled, and the empire that had seemed eternal trembled on its foundations. For a generation, Malik Shah's rule had embodied the dream of order born from chaos, a nomad's line transformed into the arbiter of civilization. His death closed the empire's golden age with sudden finality. Across the mosques of Isfahan, the Friday sermon spoke his name one last time before silence reclaimed it. The sun that had risen over the steppe and burned its way to Baghdad now began its slow descent. Yet even in decline, its light would linger long enough to illuminate the next turmoil. The assassination of the vizier, the struggle for succession, and the first tremors of a world soon to be shaken by crusaders. When Malik Shah died, the empire did not collapse with thunder, but cracked in silence. Courtiers waited for orders that would never come. Governors hesitated, uncertain which prince to obey. The Sultan's body lay in state at Isfahan, still and luminous under the green silk of mourning, while his ministers whispered over maps that had once symbolized unity. The man who might have held those maps together, Nizam al-Mulk, was already dead. His murder, a few weeks before the Sultan's passing, marked the true end of Seljuk supremacy. The vizier's death was sudden, treacherous, and symbolic. On a cold night in 1092, as his caravan passed near Nihawand, a cloaked stranger approached under the guise of a petitioner. Moments later, a blade flashed from beneath his robe. The killer was said to be an agent of the Nizari Ismailis, a sect that had turned assassination into doctrine. Whether he acted alone or under orders from court rivals remains uncertain. But the consequence was unmistakable. The empire lost its mind before it lost its heart. Without Nizam al-Mulk's authority, the delicate machinery he had designed began to grind against itself. His vast network of administrators, scholars, and judges had depended on the precision of his oversight. In his absence, ministries faltered, tax caravans went astray, and governors interpreted policy as they pleased. The bureaucratic skeleton of the empire remained, but its nervous system had gone numb. Then came the news from Isfahan. Malik Shah, too, was dead. He had fallen ill while preparing for pilgrimage to Baghdad, and rumors swirled through the empire like dust through a ruined hall. Some whispered poison, others spoke of divine judgment. Whatever the cause, the result was chaos. His sons were young, his brothers ambitious, and his widow, Turkan Khatun, moved swiftly to control the court, wielding the royal seal as though she were the rightful heir. Across the provinces, rival claimants raised their banners. In Ray, Bark-Yaruk, Malik Shah's elder son, declared himself sultan with the support of the military elite. In Baghdad, Turkan Khatun proclaimed her infant son, Mahmud, ruler under her regency, appealing to the caliph for recognition. Meanwhile, in Tabriz, another prince, Muhammad Tapa, waited for the storm to clear, gathering allies of his own. Within months, the empire was divided into overlapping sovereignties, each claiming legitimacy, none commanding obedience. The Caliph al-Muqtadi, wary of offending one faction only to be devoured by another, tried to balance between them. He recognized Bark-Yaruk in one decree and Mahmud in another, hoping to preserve the semblance of unity while chaos consumed the provinces. The cities of Persia became stages for intrigue. Armies marched under banners of brothers. Viziers were bought and sold, and letters of allegiance were rewritten as often as the seasons changed. For the common people, these struggles were not politics, but weather. an unavoidable storm that stripped fields and burned homes. In Khorasan, tax collectors fled their posts, leaving markets empty. Caravan routes grew dangerous again, preyed upon by bandits once kept at bay by imperial patrols. The calm and prosperity of Malik Shah's reign now felt like a distant myth. Chroniclers later wrote that every city had its sultan, every household its law. Among the provinces, the atabegs, military governors assigned to tutor young princes, began to act as independent rulers. What had been an instrument of central control became an engine of fragmentation. In Aleppo, Mosul, and Damascus, local dynasties rose under Seljuk names, but served their own ambitions. The empire that had once united the Islamic world now splintered into competing principalities, bound together only by memory and language. Even in death, Nizam al-Mulk's influence lingered. His writings, particularly the Siyasat-Nama, circulated among the remaining administrators, a manual for governing in an age that had forgotten governance. He had warned of such decline, that an empire survives not through conquest, but through justice. His words now read less like instruction than elegy. Meanwhile, the assassins, emboldened by their success, struck at new targets. Fortresses rose on impossible peaks, Alamut among them, and from these eyries their agents descended like shadows. The fear they inspired exceeded their number. Viziers travelled in disguise, emirs surrounded themselves with guards, and even mosques whispered of hidden daggers. The Seljuk world, which had once seemed bound by divine protection, now feared death in every market crowd. In this atmosphere of suspicion, Barkiyaruk struggled to consolidate his rule. He was brave, impulsive, and burdened by the weight of comparison to his father. His campaigns against rival claimants bled the treasury dry, and every victory seemed to breed a new revolt. He defeated Mahmud's forces near Isfahan, only to face rebellion from his uncles in Syria and Fars. The empire no longer moved as one body. It thrashed like a wounded animal. The caliph, watching from Baghdad, understood that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. No longer could one sultan command both east and west. The Seljuk world had entered its era of divided sovereignties, brothers ruling in rivalry, provinces obeying out of habit rather than fear. The unity that had once restored the caliphate's dignity now threatened to erase it again. Still, the name Seljuk retained its aura. To the cities that remembered Tughrel's justice or Malik Shah's prosperity, that name carried the echo of stability. Even rival princes invoked it to legitimize their claims. The idea of the empire endured, though the empire itself was dissolving. By 1095, after 3 years of war, Barkiyaruk emerged as the nominal victor, ruling from Baghdad to Khorasan. His triumph, however, was hollow. The treasury was empty, the provinces autonomous, and the army divided between tribal loyalties and unpaid mercenaries. The dream of a single Seljuk order had ended. Far away, in the ports of the Mediterranean, a different storm was gathering, one born not of family ambition, but of faith. Rumors reached the east of kings and knights crossing the sea, of banners marked with the sign of the cross. The Muslim world, still bleeding from its internal wounds, scarcely noticed at first. But soon, from the shores of Antioch and the walls of Jerusalem, a new war would roar into being. The empire that had once united Islam under one standard would now face a challenge unlike any before. In the shadow of assassinations and civil war, the Crusaders were coming. The news arrived like a fable too absurd to believe. Armed pilgrims had crossed the sea. They spoke of liberation, of holy war, of reclaiming lands that had not belonged to their ancestors for centuries. To the Seljuk princes who ruled in fragments of the once great empire, these tales sounded like the exaggerations of merchants, yet the rumor thickened into reality. In the year 1096, the first armies of the Crusade marched across Byzantine lands and descended upon the east, a tide of armored strangers under banners painted with the cross. The Seljuk world at that moment was a map of disunity. Malik Shah's heirs still warred in Persia and Iraq. Barkiyaruk held Baghdad but not peace. Tutush, his uncle, ruled Syria in uneasy independence. And in Anatolia, Kile Arslan I struggled to hold the Sultanate of Rum together after years of internecine war. The empire that had once stretched unbroken from the Oxus to the Mediterranean was now a mosaic of quarrels, each province rich, each ruler cautious, none united. In the west, the Turks of Anatolia had spent a generation carving new lives out of the ruins of Byzantine dominion. The plateau had filled with nomads and settlers who built towns where imperial estates once stood. Roads once patrolled by Greek soldiers were now guarded by Turkmen tribes, who moved between agriculture and raiding with equal ease. Kilij Arslan ruled from Nicaea, a city wrested from Byzantium and reshaped into a Seljuk capital. His warriors were fierce but few, his alliances fragile. He had enemies among neighboring beyliks, rivals who measured every Seljuk success as a threat to their own freedom. When the first wave of crusaders reached his borders, they were not knights, but peasants, untrained, ill-armed, driven by visions of prophecy. This so-called People's Crusade was crushed swiftly. The plains of Anatolia devoured them, yet in their wake came a force of another kind, princes of France, dukes of Normandy, counts of Flanders, each commanding disciplined knights and bound together by the promise of divine redemption. To Kile Arslan, they appeared at first as another raid to repel. To history, they marked the beginning of transformation. In 1097, the crusading host, escorted by Byzantine guides, surrounded Nicaea. The siege lasted weeks. Despite Kilij Arslan's attempts to relieve the city, the defenders, starved and terrified, surrendered not to him, but to the Byzantines. The fall of his capital was a humiliation that shattered his authority. Forced to retreat deeper into the plateau, he lured the enemy into the narrow valleys near Dorylaeum. There, on the first day of July, he struck. A sudden, furious ambush that nearly broke the Christian army. But the Crusaders held firm until reinforcements arrived, turning disaster into triumph. The Turkish cavalry withdrew, leaving behind the smouldering wreck of its pride. In the months that followed, the Crusaders advanced through central Anatolia unopposed. Turkish garrisons abandoned their posts. Tribal leaders withdrew to the mountains, and entire regions fell silent. By the time they reached Cilicia, the road to Syria lay open. The steppe-born power that had dominated Asia Minor for a generation now dissolved into scattered warlords. Kilij Arslan fled eastward, nursing vengeance and disbelief. In the cities of the Levant, Seljuk governors watched these events with growing alarm. Antioch, Aleppo, Mosul, and Damascus all flew the banners of rival princes, each claiming descent from the same dynasty, but none willing to fight under another's command. The chroniclers of Baghdad recorded their astonishment. Never before had so many Muslim rulers failed to act in concert. To the scholars who traced God's will in history, it seemed that the unity once restored by the Seljuks had been withdrawn as punishment. When the Crusaders reached Antioch in 1098, the city was under the rule of Yagi Sian, a Turk loyal to Tutush's sons. For months, the siege dragged on. Disease, starvation, and betrayal gnawed at both sides. Kilij Arslan, still recovering from his defeat, gathered allies, but arrived too late to lift the siege. The city fell. Its inhabitants were slaughtered. Among the survivors who fled east, stories spread of atrocities so grotesque that many refused to believe them. But those who doubted soon learned the truth when the Crusaders pressed on toward Jerusalem. By 1099, the Holy City, garrisoned by Fatimid troops, faced the combined might of the crusading princes. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. From Cairo to Baghdad, from Nishapur to Konya, the news spread with a grief deeper than politics. Mosques filled with lamentation. Poets wrote of divine wrath. Preachers called for unity, but none came. The Seljuks, still locked in fratricidal war, could offer no defense. Their empire, which had once shielded the caliphate and ruled the pilgrimage roads, now stood fragmented and inward-looking, while strangers claimed the heart of Islam's third holiest city. The first Crusaders carved their victories into the landscape. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Between these new realms and the remnants of the Seljuk domains stretched a frontier of confusion. Traders crossed it with caution, pilgrims with fear. The old routes between Syria and Anatolia turned dangerous, and caravans began to detour through Mesopotamia or the deserts of Arabia. Among the Muslim chroniclers who recorded these years, astonishment gives way to self-reproach. They wrote of princes squabbling over taxes while cities burned, of scholars debating inheritance law while Christendom armed itself. Yet amid this despair, the Seljuk world endured in fragments. The Sultan in Baghdad still commanded allegiance, however nominal, and his cousins in Syria and Anatolia still invoked his name in prayer. The structure of empire had shattered, but its spirit lingered in custom, language, and faith. By 1100, the Crusaders had exhausted themselves. Their victories were immense but precarious. A handful of garrisons surrounded by a hostile world. In the Seljuk East, Muhammad Tapar, Barkiyaruk's brother, was gathering strength, determined to restore the unity his predecessors had squandered. The clash between Crusader ambition and Seljuk recovery would define the next generation. For now, the West celebrated while the East mourned. The crescent and the cross faced each other across the walls of Antioch and Jerusalem, each convinced of divine favor, each blind to the cost of its faith. The First Crusade had succeeded, not because the invaders were stronger, but because their enemies had forgotten how to be one. Somewhere in Khorasan, a messenger rode through the dust to deliver this news to Sultan Muhammad Tapar. The empire, though wounded, still breathed, and under his hand it would seek to gather itself again, if only for one last age of strength. After the first Crusaders swept through, their kingdoms glimmered only for a breath, sharp and bright as drawn blades. Their triumphs, however, had been carved from the fractures of the East. While Syria burned and Anatolia bled, a quieter struggle unfolded across Persia. The slow, deliberate effort to bind the Seljuk world together once more. The work of rebuilding fell to two men of the same blood. Muhammad Tapar, the son of Malik Shah, and Ahmad Sanjar, his younger brother, the last great prince of their house. When Muhammad Tapar took the throne in 1105, the empire he inherited was an empire only in name. Barkiyaruk's wars had drained its treasuries and scattered its loyalty. Cities paid taxes to whoever held their gates. Provinces obeyed the strongest army within reach. Yet even in this exhaustion, the Seljuk name still commanded respect. The Caliph in Baghdad acknowledged Muhammad as Sultan, while rival princes hesitated to challenge him outright. With cautious patience, he began to rebuild. His first task was to restore the arteries of administration that had collapsed after Nizam al-Mulk's death. From Isfahan, He revived the system of Ikta grants, ensuring that soldiers received their lands directly from the Sultan rather than from local governors. Tribute began to flow again, and with it came stability. Persian secretaries returned to their ledgers, scribes to their offices, and tax collectors to their caravans. The hum of bureaucracy returned, the quiet sound of empire rediscovering itself. In these same years, the Nizari Ismailis remained the ever-present spectre on the horizon. Their mountain strongholds dotted the Iranian plateau like dark stars, defying siege and inspiring terror. Muhammad Tapa understood that brute force could not easily dislodge them. Instead, he waged a campaign of attrition, isolating their trade routes, bribing allies to defect, and launching swift raids that wore down their resolve. His victories were small but cumulative. The assassins retreated deeper into their stone citadels, turning from open rebellion to guarded survival. Despite his successes, unity remained elusive. The empire's provinces had grown used to independence. In Syria and Anatolia, Seljuk princes ruled as semi-sovereign monarchs, minting their own coins and negotiating with crusaders and Byzantines alike. Even in Khorasan, the distant marches of the east, loyalty was bound not to a throne, but to a personality. There, Ahmad Sanjar had established his own dominion, a realm of order and prosperity that would soon eclipse his brothers. Sanjar's court at Merv became the envy of the Islamic world. While the western provinces fought over titles, Khorasan glowed with confidence. Caravanserais lined the roads, mosques rose beside canals, and scholars gathered beneath turquoise domes to debate philosophy and astronomy. Persian literature reached a new refinement, and poets such as Anvari and Kakani sang of kingship, love, and fate. Sanjar's realm was smaller than Malik Shah's, yet more secure, and in its discipline, many saw a reflection of the empire's former grandeur. Unlike his predecessors, Sanjar preferred continuity over conquest. He ruled through compromise, balancing Turkic emirs, Persian administrators, and Arab clerics in an uneasy harmony. His viziers, following the old principles of Nizam al-Mulk, maintained schools and endowments that trained the next generation of jurists. Sunni orthodoxy flourished, yet Sanjar was no zealot. He allowed debate within limits, believing that faith, like empire, required structure, but not rigidity. Under his watch, Khorasan became a sanctuary for art and intellect. Historians chronicled the Seljuk past with reverence. Astronomers charted the stars with mathematical precision. Even in Baghdad, where the Caliph still held court, people spoke of Sanjar's domain as the true heart of the Muslim East. Yet every empire that turns inward begins to forget the restlessness that birthed it. Beyond Sanjar's borders, new powers were stirring. Khwarezm in the north, the Karakhanids beyond the Oxus, and tribal confederations that no longer feared the Sultan's cavalry. While he tended his gardens of order, the wild grass beyond the walls began to grow unchecked. When Muhammad Tapa died in 1118, Sanjar inherited not only the eastern provinces, but the imperial title itself. He became Sultan of the Great Seljuks, a title that sounded grander than the reality it described. His authority stretched in theory from the Caspian to the Tigris, yet in practice, much of that world obeyed him only in prayer. Still, his personal power was formidable. His armies were disciplined, his treasury full, and his reputation immense. For 3 decades, Sanjar presided over what later historians would call the empire's last golden age. Peace reigned across Khorasan, and even the restless Turkmen tribes accepted his command. The roads to India and China remained open. carrying silks, spices, and news of distant courts. In the west, the Crusaders consolidated their rule in Jerusalem, but their victories no longer stirred panic in the east. The Seljuks of Iran had survived the storm, and in Sanjar's careful governance, they seemed to have rediscovered their purpose. Still, the surface calm hid cracks that widened year by year. The structure Nizam al-Mulk had designed depended on the strength of one central will. Once that will faltered, the system strained. Sanjar's governors grew wealthy, his commanders complacent. The army, fed by Iqtar revenues, grew accustomed to privilege. Among the Turkmen clans that roamed the frontier, resentment simmered. They had once been the empire's sword, but now they were treated as unruly dependents. The Sultan, absorbed in ceremony and scholarship, underestimated the danger. He imagined his prestige alone could bind the frontier tribes to obedience. But power, like the desert wind, never stays still for long. In the distant steppes of Transoxiana, murmurs of rebellion began to stir among the Oghuz, the same people from whom the Seljuks themselves had sprung. For the moment, Sanjar's world still held, serene, luminous, deceptively whole. The cities of Persia glittered with poetry, the scholars of Nishapur lectured beneath domes of light, and the bazaars of Merv overflowed with silk and gold. To travelers who crossed his realm, it seemed that the age of disorder had passed forever. But history was already coiling beneath that stillness. The stability of Sanjar's reign would prove a mirage, its peace the calm before the storm. And when the storm broke, it would not come from crusaders or rival kings, but from within the same nomadic heart that had once carried the Seljuks to glory. In his later years, Sultan Sanjar presided over an empire that seemed unshakable, a web of cities, caravan roads, and fortresses spanning the eastern world. Merchants in Merv boasted that no road under the Sultan's banner was unsafe, no market unattended by the law. Yet empires rarely fall from outside assault. They erode from within. Beneath the surface of Sanjar's prosperity, the old steppe forces that had built the Seljuk realm were stirring again, impatient with walls, laws, and bureaucrats who no longer remembered the wind. The spark came from the Oghuz, nomadic tribes whose ancestors had once followed Seljuk himself across the Sirdarya. For decades, they had served as frontier auxiliaries, guarding the empire's northeastern borderlands. They paid reluctant tribute, grazed their herds on imperial land, and endured the arrogance of governors who treated them as hired muscle. By mid-century, that balance broke. A dispute over taxation, as trivial in cause as it was vast in consequence, set the steppe ablaze. In the spring of 1153, the Oghuz Confederation rose in revolt. Sanjar, now an aging ruler in his 70s, marched north from Merv to crush the rebellion. His army was still formidable, disciplined regiments of cavalry, banners bright with gold embroidery, and the proud confidence of past victories. But the Sultan had misjudged the enemy. The Oghuz were not a rabble. They were his own mirror, riders of the same blood, fighting with the same mobility that had once made the Seljuks unconquerable. Near the oasis of Mervrud, the imperial camp was surrounded. What began as a skirmish became a disaster. The Oghuz cut off the army's water, harried its supply lines, and attacked from every direction. Within days, discipline dissolved. Sanjar's troops, unused to hardship, fled into the desert. The Sultan himself was captured, the conqueror of Persia reduced to a hostage among his ancestral kin. Chroniclers later wrote that the Oghuz treated him with reluctant respect, building him a tent and forcing him to watch as his empire unraveled. For 3 years, Sanjar lived in captivity while his dominion collapsed. Governors in Nishapur, Herat, and Balkh declared independence. Persian cities fortified their walls against both nomads and each other. The caliph in Baghdad, hearing of the sultan's downfall, offered prayers but little aid. The prestige that had once bound east and west under Seljuk command vanished in an instant. When Sanjar escaped in 1156, he returned to find an empire in ruins. Merv, once the jewel of Khorasan, stood half empty. Its canals were silted, its scholars scattered, its markets silent. The Sultan, weary and broken, spent his final years attempting to restore what could not be repaired. He died in 1157, leaving no heir strong enough to carry the name forward. With him ended the line of the great Seljuks, the dynasty that had ruled the heart of Islam for more than a century. What remained were fragments. In Persia, local dynasties, the Khurshid's in Tabaristan, the Salgurids in Fars, governed in Seljuk style, but owed allegiance to no one. In the west, the Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia thrived under its own princes, adapting Turkic traditions to Byzantine soil. The unity that had once stretched from the Oxus to the Mediterranean was gone, replaced by a constellation of small powers that borrowed Seljuk legitimacy while abandoning its discipline. Amid the ruins, new forces began to rise. In the northeast, the kingdom of Khwarezm, once a Seljuk vassal, asserted independence. Its rulers, the Anushteginids, inherited both the Seljuk administrative model and their appetite for conquest. As the 12th century waned, their banners advanced across the Oxus, swallowing what remained of Khorasan. Persian poets now praised Khwarezmian courts instead of Seljuk ones. Historians wrote of new empires without quite daring to call the old one dead. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate stirred from centuries of subservience. The weakening of Seljuk control allowed the caliphs to reassert local authority, reclaiming the right to tax and govern in their own name. They celebrated this as divine restoration, though their newfound independence owed more to circumstance than strength. The once symbiotic bond between caliph and sultan, sermon and sword united, was finally broken. The scholars who lived through these years described the change as if a long season had ended. The prosperity of Malik Shah's age, with its ordered roads and illuminated manuscripts, gave way to uncertainty. Trade declined, irrigation works decayed, cities turned inward. The spirit of the Seljuks, however, survived in subtler ways. In the bureaucracies they had built, the madrasas they had endowed, the legal schools they had protected. Even in decline, they had transformed the Islamic world's texture. In Anatolia, the Seljuks of Rum inherited that legacy with unexpected vitality. There, among mountains once ruled by Byzantines, the Turkic settlers who followed Alp Arslan's armies had grown into city builders. Konya, Sivas, and Kayseri flourished as centers of commerce and Sufi learning. Their rulers minted coins bearing the same titles once used in Isfahan, Sultan of the East and West, as though the dream of unity still burned in miniature. Elsewhere, the lands of Iran fragmented further. Local warlords adopted the titles of Atabeg, Malik, or Emir, reviving the tribal mosaic the Seljuks had once subdued. The empire's edges blurred until even chroniclers could no longer define where it ended. Yet the Seljuk name remained a measure of legitimacy. To call oneself a Seljuk was to invoke memory, the golden decades when justice, scholarship, and strength had moved together under one banner. By the time Saladin rose in Egypt and Syria, uniting the Muslims against the Crusaders, the Seljuk realm was only a ghost, but it was a ghost that still spoke. Saladin's administrators used Seljuk models. His armies employed Seljuk tactics. The institutions built by Tugril, Nizam al-Mulk, and Malik Shah had outlived their founders, shaping every state that came after. In the closing decades of the 12th century, Persian poets looked east and west and saw only fragments of what had been: isolated courts, scattered scholars, silent observatories. Yet in their verses ran an undercurrent of nostalgia. They remembered the time when law and learning had shared the same house, when the Caliph and the Sultan had stood side by side. That memory would become myth, the kind that no empire can live without. The great Seljuks had fallen, but their descendants endured in Anatolia's plains, in Persia's chancelleries, and in the imagination of a world that still dreamed of unity. And in those dreams, the hoofbeats of their horses never quite faded. Long before the fall of the great Seljuks, the seeds of renewal had already taken root in the west. Across the mountains of Anatolia, where the plains of Asia met the sea, a new branch of the dynasty had begun to grow, one shaped by exile, war, and the slow fusion of cultures. It would inherit the name Seljuk, yet its heart would beat to a different rhythm. The Sultanate of Rum, meaning Rome, took its name from the land it claimed. The former Byzantine territories now under Turkic rule. Its founder, Süleyman ibn Kutulmish, was a cousin of Alp Arslan, descended from a line once denied the Seljuk throne. Excluded from power in Persia, he turned westward and built an empire from the wreckage of another. Around 1077, amid the ruins left by Manzikert, he declared his independence and made Nicaea his capital. Anatolia in those years was a land of chaos and opportunity. Byzantine authority had collapsed beyond the Bosporus. Garrisons deserted, peasants fled, and nomads claimed the fields. Into this vacuum came waves of Turkic settlers, warriors, herdsmen, artisans, and families who had followed Alp Arslan's armies from the east. They built villages where imperial estates had stood and raised mosques from the stones of fallen churches. Over time, the landscape itself began to change. Greek villages took Turkic names. Christian farmers adopted the language of their new lords, and the call to prayer echoed beside the tolling of distant bells. Suleiman ruled as both warrior and diplomat. He recognized the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, seeking legitimacy that the Byzantines could not give. Yet he also negotiated with Constantinople when convenience required. His ambition extended beyond Anatolia. In 1086, he marched south into Syria, hoping to seize Aleppo and link his dominion with the broader Seljuk world. There, his fortune turned. Trapped between rival Turkish princes, Suleiman fell in battle. His death fractured the young sultanate, but not its destiny. For decades afterward, Anatolia was contested ground. The Crusaders marched through it, carving their bloody road toward Jerusalem, while Byzantine emperors sought to reclaim what had been lost. Yet amid this turbulence, the Seljuks of Rum endured. Their leaders learned the art of survival, allying when they could, resisting when they must. By the early 12th century, under Kilij Arslan I and his descendants, the Sultanate began to cohere into something more than a frontier kingdom. Its capital shifted from Nicaea to Konya, a city rising from the bones of ancient Iconium. There, the architecture of Persia met the masonry of Byzantium. Domes crowned with turquoise tiles rose above Roman arches, and caravanserai lined the roads like sentinels of stone. Persian secretaries managed the chancery, while Greek artisans built palaces for their new masters. The result was not imitation, but synthesis, a fusion that would give Anatolia its lasting character. The sultans of Rum inherited the Seljuk military tradition, yet they adapted it to the terrain they ruled. Their armies mixed mounted archers with local infantry, Christian mercenaries with Turkic tribesmen. Warfare in Anatolia was less about annihilation than endurance, raids, sieges, shifting alliances. Against the Byzantines, the sultans fought as often with treaties as with swords. Against the Crusaders, they alternated between conflict and trade, supplying horses, grain, and guides to armies that might one day turn against them. By the middle of the 12th century, the Sultanate had grown strong enough to define its own destiny. Masud I, reigning from 1116 to 1156, consolidated control over central Anatolia and rebuilt the cities ravaged by decades of war. Under his direction, caravan routes reopened from Konya to Kayseri and onward to the Black Sea. Trade flowed once again, silks from Iran, furs from the steppes, glass from Syria. Markets filled with Greek, Armenian, and Arab merchants bargaining in a dozen tongues. The court of Masud mirrored this diversity. Poets from Persia, jurists from Baghdad, and local craftsmen shared the same patronage. While the great Seljuks of Iran faded into history, their Anatolian cousins thrived on mixture. Islam here was confident but flexible, shaped as much by Sufi mystics as by orthodox scholars. The dervish orders, traveling preachers and poets, began to spread across the countryside, binding Turkic tribes and urban dwellers alike in a common spiritual language. Their lodges, humble at first, would later become the soul of Anatolian Islam. The sultans, though born of nomadic stock, embraced the permanence of cities. Konya blossomed into a new Isfahan, its palaces adorned with marble and gold, its libraries filled with manuscripts rescued from the East. The arts of architecture and calligraphy flourished. Stone gates bore verses from the Quran carved beside geometric stars. From the high roads of Sivas to the mountain fortresses of Antalya, the mark of Seljuk artisanship spread, austere, intricate, enduring. Yet even as the Sultanate of Rum reached maturity, it remained a world in balance between threat and opportunity. To the west, the Byzantine Empire revived under the Komnenoi, pressing again into the frontier. To the east, the Danish Mendids, a rival Turkic dynasty, challenged Konya's supremacy. Within Anatolia itself, the diversity that enriched the state also made it fragile. Armenians, Greeks, and Turkmen each sought autonomy under Seljuk rule. The sultans answered with pragmatism, tolerance where possible, force where necessary. By the end of the 12th century, the Sultanate of Rum had become the stable heart of Anatolia. Its rulers minted coins bearing both Arabic inscriptions and the image of a lion and sun, a symbol that fused Turkic myth with Persian artistry. Its cities were open to merchants from Venice and Genoa, its scholars to the mystics who wandered from Khorasan. The echoes of the old empire still guided it, yet its spirit was unmistakably new, Anatolian, mercantile, and confident. While the eastern Seljuks vanished under the weight of rebellion and invasion, the western branch endured by adaptability. The lessons learned from centuries of movement had turned into an art of staying still, of governing, building, and blending. And in that stillness, a new kind of power began to grow, one rooted not in the steppe's freedom, but in the city's permanence. On a winter's night, near the year 1200, the towers of Konya glowed with lantern light. In the royal palace, scribes worked by candle flame, as envoys from Byzantium waited for audience. Beyond the walls, caravans rested after journeys from Aleppo, Mosul, and Tabriz. The empire that had once been born of nomadic exile had found a home. The Seljuk star had shifted westward, its brilliance steady against the dark. But beyond the mountains of Persia, the world was stirring again. a new century would bring both triumph and terror, and the Sultanate of Rum, at the height of its prosperity, would soon hear the thunder of hooves that no fortress could withstand. By the turn of the 13th century, the Sultanate of Rum stood at the height of its splendor. The scars of war had faded. The land between the Taurus Mountains and the Aegean shimmered with cities, fields, and caravan routes. Across Anatolia, mosques rose beside Byzantine basilicas, and the languages of merchants mingled in the markets of Konya and Kayseri. What had begun as a colony of exiles now claimed the mantle of empire. The Sultan who presided over this renewal was Kaikhusraw I, a man of uncertain fortune and remarkable resilience. Twice driven from his throne, twice restored, he ruled with a blend of caution and ambition, born from survival. His reign marked the transition from conquest to permanence, the transformation of a frontier principality into a confident state. He rebuilt Konya's walls, reformed its coinage, and reopened the caravan routes that link the Mediterranean to the heart of Asia. Under his protection, Anatolia became not merely a refuge for Turks, but a bridge between civilizations. When Kaikhusraw fell in battle in 1211, his son Kaikous I continued his father's work, negotiating peace with Byzantium and extending the Sultanate's influence across the Black Sea ports. Yet the dynasty's true brilliance would come with Kaikos's brother and successor, Alaeddin Kaikubad I, a ruler whose name would become synonymous with prosperity, architecture, and enlightened power. Kaikubad ascended the throne in 1220, at a moment when fortune favored Anatolia. The Crusader kingdoms to the south were exhausted, Byzantium weakened by civil strife, and the Mongol tide not yet upon the world. Between these collapsing giants, the Sultanate of Rum flourished in calm isolation, free to build rather than defend. Kaikubad proved the ideal craftsman for this interlude of peace. From his capital in Konya, he envisioned an empire of stone and order. Fortresses rose on the frontiers, cities expanded under meticulous planning. He fortified Kayseri, adorned Sivas with madrasas, and transformed Alanya, once a pirate stronghold, into a gleaming port that opened Anatolia to Mediterranean trade. Travelers from Egypt and Venice alike marveled at the precision of his roads and the safety of his domains. The Sultan's court became a refuge for poets, architects, and scholars displaced from the east, carrying with them the intellectual heritage of the fading Persian world. Commerce was the lifeblood of Kaikubad's reign. Caravansaries, monumental inns built at intervals along the main highways, offered rest and protection to travelers. Their courtyards echoed with the sound of hooves and the murmur of many tongues, Persian, Arabic, Greek, and even Latin. These sanctuaries of exchange, protected by royal decree, knit the Sultanate into the global web of trade that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Adriatic. Within their walls, merchants weighed silk against silver, spices against glass, while Sufi dervishes offered prayers for their journeys. Under Kaikubad, Anatolia's prosperity became visible in its architecture. The Sultan Han near Aksaray, the Alaeddin Mosque in Konya, and the citadels of Alanya and Kayseri stand as monuments to an age when power sought permanence through beauty. The Sultan's own palace at Konya shimmered with mosaics and marble, its halls adorned with turquoise tiles that mirrored the Anatolian sky. Chroniclers described his reign as a second Isfahan, a golden age reborn west of the Euphrates. The Sultan's vision extended beyond architecture to diplomacy. He fostered ties with the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, granting them trading privileges in exchange for naval expertise. Their ships carried Anatolian grain and textiles across the Mediterranean, returning with glassware, cloth, and ideas. Through these exchanges, the Sultanate of Rum joined the commercial network that would later sustain the Renaissance. A bridge not only of geography, but of culture. Kaikubad's rule was not without tension. The Armenian kingdom of Cilicia and the Byzantine successor states still tested his borders. In the east, the Khwarezmian Empire, expanding after the collapse of the Great Seljuks, brushed against the Anatolian frontier. Kaikubad managed these challenges through a careful balance of force and negotiation. His armies, well-trained and diverse, combined Turkic cavalry with Armenian and Frankish mercenaries. When war came, it was swift and precise, a demonstration of strength rather than desperation. Yet the Sultan's greatest achievement lay not in conquest, but in cohesion. Anatolia under his reign became a world of mingled peoples bound by law and tolerance. Greek farmers worked the same fields as Turkmen nomads. Armenian merchants financed caravans guarded by Muslim soldiers. The courts of Konya dispensed justice in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish alike. Faith, for all its differences, coexisted within the boundaries of order. Still, history offers no lasting peace. From the east, whispers began to reach the Sultan's court. Tales of horsemen who left no survivors, of cities consumed by fire and dust. The Mongols, newly risen under Genghis Khan, had already shattered Khwarezm and burned the ancient cities of Transoxiana. Their scouts were sighted beyond the Caspian, their envoys at the gates of Persia. Kaikubad, ever cautious, strengthened his fortresses and gathered intelligence, sensing that the calm which had defined his reign could not endure forever. When he died suddenly in 1237, the unity he had preserved began to fray. His son, Kaikhusro II, inherited a realm rich but vulnerable. The court divided between factions, Turkmen generals, Persian administrators, and ambitious emirs. The merchants still filled the bazaars, the scholars still lectured in madrasas, but beneath the surface of wealth and confidence, fear began to move like an undercurrent. By the early 1240s, the Mongols had reached the edges of Anatolia. Refugees from the east poured into Konya, carrying stories of slaughter and submission. Kaikhusro, though brave, lacked his father's steadiness. He marshaled his forces and sought alliances, but against the tide approaching from the steppes, even courage would not suffice. In the spring of 1243, the Sultan's banners gathered near the town of Kursidar. There, in the mountain passes of eastern Anatolia, the age of Seljuk prosperity would meet its reckoning. For nearly 2 centuries, the sons of the steppe had ruled from palaces of marble and faith. Now, another generation of horsemen was coming, harder, hungrier, and unstoppable. The sound of their approach was already echoing through the valleys. Across the high ridges of eastern Anatolia, wind carried rumors faster than caravans. Traders from Tabriz spoke of entire provinces erased, of citadels swallowed by fire, of armies that advanced like a moving horizon. In the caravanserais of Sivas and Erzurum, men whispered of an empire that obeyed no sultan or caliph, a storm of horsemen whose banners bore no god but conquest. Their name passed from mouth to mouth until even the shepherds of the Taurus knew it, the Mongols. In Konya's marble halls, the news arrived wrapped in disbelief. To Sultan Kaikhusro II, heir of Kaikubad's glory, these stories sounded like old travelers' tales, the exaggerations of frightened men. His realm was rich, his fortresses secure, and his army the largest since Malik Shah. Yet wealth can be a veil for weakness. The prosperity his father had built had softened the resolve of those meant to defend it. Ministers quarreled, emirs envied one another, and soldiers, long untested, preferred ceremony to hardship. Far to the east, the truth had already arrived. Smoke darkened the skies over Iran, where Mongol detachments under the general Baiju Noyan had reduced cities to ashes. They moved with an efficiency that defied imagination. No disorder, no mercy, no pause. Their siege engines were dragged across mountains. Their scouts mapped roads once thought impassable. Where they passed, the map itself seemed to change. The Khwarezmian Empire, once the terror of its neighbors, had fallen without recovery. Now their gaze turned west, toward Anatolia's green valleys and the golden cities of Rum. Kai Khusro inherited prosperity, but not prudence. Raised amid poets and courtiers, he believed diplomacy could tame every threat. When the first Mongol envoys reached him, demanding submission and tribute in the name of the great Khan, he dismissed them with a show of royal defiance. Tribute, he declared, was the duty of vassals, and the Seljuks of Rum were no one's vassals. The decision was cheered in court, but quietly dreaded in the barracks. The Mongols had defeated armies larger than his. Their reputation was not mere legend. Still, pride is a habit that seldom breaks until it must. By spring, his forces gathered near Sivas. From every corner of the realm came contingents, Turkic cavalry from the central plains, Armenian allies from Cilicia, Kurdish and Arab auxiliaries, Frankish mercenaries hired at staggering cost. Even bands of Greek soldiers from the western provinces answered the call. Chroniclers estimated 60,000 men under the Sultan's standard, though few shared the same language or loyalty. The army that formed was vast but incoherent, united only by uncertainty. Meanwhile, Baiju's troops, smaller, leaner, better disciplined, advanced from the east, following the mountain passes like a tide through stone. Dust rose before dawn when the two forces met near the slopes of Kösedar, a wilderness of ravines and open plains between Sivas and Azinkan. The Mongols arrived in silence, their lines precise as script. Kai Khusro positioned his men across the valley, his banners glittering in the morning sun. Behind him, his generals argued over tactics. Some urged caution, others an immediate assault. The Sultan, eager to prove strength, chose attack. His cavalry charged down the slope, thunderous and bright, their lances gleaming like the dawn. The first clash seemed to favor the Seljuks. Mongol units fell back in apparent disorder, and the Sultan's right wing pressed forward with cries of triumph. But the retreat was an illusion, a deliberate unraveling meant to draw the enemy in. As the pursuit scattered the Seljuk formation, Baiju's hidden squadrons wheeled around the flanks. Arrows fell like rain, cutting through armor and horse alike. The valley filled with smoke and screams. Confusion spread faster than command. Kai Khusro's center held for an hour, then broke. His mercenaries fled first, then the Turkmen cavalry, who saw their leaders fall. The Sultan tried to rally them, but his voice was drowned by the chaos. When the sun reached its height, the field was already lost. The Mongols advanced methodically, slaughtering where they met resistance and sparing only those who surrendered. By evening, the Seljuk army had ceased to exist. From the ridges above the battlefield, the survivors watched the smoke rise in black spirals. What had begun as a test of strength ended as revelation, proof that the world had changed. No fortress, however thick its walls, could stop this new force. The Mongols moved through the ruins as calmly as farmers harvesting fields. Their banners bore no boast, their officers no visible emotion. War to them was not glory, but labor. Kai Khusro fled westward with a handful of guards, abandoning his treasury and camp. In Sivas, the people barred their gates, hoping to bargain for mercy. It was a wise choice. Baiju demanded tribute, not slaughter. Cities that submitted were spared, their governors confirmed under Mongol supervision. Those that resisted were leveled. Kayseri, defiant and proud, burned for 3 days before its walls were pulled down stone by stone. Within months, the Sultanate of Rum ceased to exist as an independent power. When Baiju entered Konya, he found no army waiting. The Sultan had retreated farther west, his pride reduced to negotiation. Envoys carried his plea to the Mongol camp: acceptance of vassalage, payment of tribute, and acknowledgement of Mongol supremacy. Baiju agreed. The terms were simple and absolute: annual payments of gold, horses, and slaves, the right of Mongol envoys to reside at court, and unconditional military support when summoned. The once sovereign Seljuks became clients of the Ilkhanate before the Ilkhanate even existed. Under Mongol oversight, Anatolia entered a strange twilight. Cities reopened their markets. Trade resumed along guarded roads. The conquerors did not wish to destroy wealth they could tax. Their governors, pragmatic and detached, ruled through local intermediaries. Persian administrators served beside Mongol officials, and the courts of Konya echoed with a new language of obedience. The Sultan retained his title, but not his freedom. His decrees required Mongol approval, his crown Mongol consent. In the countryside, however, the spirit of resistance flickered. Sufi mystics and poets began to speak of patience as victory, of endurance as defiance. They urged faith in the face of humiliation, transforming political submission into moral resilience. In their gatherings, the sorrow of conquest became the seed of a new identity, one that would outlast the empire that had fallen. The lodges of dervishes grew in number, offering solace where law could not. Their teachings whispered that ruin, too, was a form of renewal. By the decade's end, Anatolia had adapted to its conquerors. The Mongols collected tribute with ruthless regularity, but they also ensured the roads were safe, the caravans unmolested. Konya's scholars continued to write, its artisans to build. Yet the grandeur of Kaikubad's age was gone, replaced by the stillness of survival. The Sultan's court lived in imitation of the past. Rituals preserved without conviction, poetry composed in praise of power that no longer existed. When Kai Khusro died in 1246, he left a kingdom outwardly intact, but hollow within. His sons were too young to rule, his emirs too divided to unite. The Mongol yoke, though light at first, tightened as the decades passed. Each generation paid its tribute and called it peace. From the vantage of history, the Battle of Kosei Dagh stands not only as a defeat, but as a transformation. It marked the moment when the Seljuks ceased to be masters of their fate and became instruments in the shaping of a new world. Under Mongol rule, Anatolia remained a land of trade and learning, but the direction of its destiny had shifted forever. In the long perspective of centuries, that defeat preserved what victory might have destroyed. The Mongols brought devastation, yet their order kept Anatolia from disintegration. Through them, the region absorbed influences from China, Persia, and the steppe, blending them into a single Anatolian fabric. The Seljuk legacy endured, muted but unbroken, awaiting the next power that would inherit both its ruins and its dream. As dusk settled over the silent battlefield of Kosei Dagh, carrion birds wheeled above the remnants of armor and banners half buried in dust. The empire of the steppe had met the empire of the world and found itself measured, conquered, and changed. In that collision of winds, east meeting west, the last light of the Seljuks faded into the twilight of empire, giving way to an age not of kings, but of survivors. In the years following Köse Da, the scribes of Konya continued to copy decrees whose authority ended at the city gate. Each morning they dipped their pens in ink and wrote in the name of a sultan who ruled less with command than with ceremony. The seals were impressed, the scrolls dispatched, and couriers rode into provinces that now obeyed other masters. From the outside, the Sultanate of Rum still resembled an empire. Its mosques filled on Fridays, its markets thrived, its palaces glittered. But its pulse had slowed to a rhythm set in distant Tabriz, where Mongol officials dictated its fate. The young sultans, who inherited Kai Khusraw's throne, wore crowns too heavy for their years. Regents governed in their names, balancing between Mongol generals, Persian administrators, and fractious emirs. Loyalty had become a transaction, measured in taxes delivered and tribute paid. Every spring, caravans loaded with silver, silk, and horses departed for the Ilkhanid capital. Their safe passage guaranteed peace, and peace, though humiliating, was preferable to annihilation. Konya learned the art of endurance, a statecraft of patience, formality, and silence. Inside the palace, the rituals of kingship persisted. Poets recited verses of conquest to princes who had never seen a battlefield. Musicians performed in the shadow of courtiers who bowed lower than necessity demanded. The illusion of sovereignty became its own occupation, maintained through etiquette and memory. Outside the city, however, power was fragmenting. Mongol assessors measured land, counted herds, and issued edicts in a script no Turkic soldier could read. Governors who submitted were confirmed in office. Those who resisted were replaced. Authority flowed eastward like tribute, leaving behind empty titles and gilded chambers. In the countryside, abandonment took quieter forms. Fields once managed by royal inspectors passed into private hands. Turkmen clans roamed the plains, grazing herds where armies had once drilled. Bandits and saints both found followers among the dispossessed. The lines between outlaw, holy man, and tribal chief blurred in a landscape that no longer recognized distant rulers. The state's backbone, its bureaucracy and army, survived only where local initiative kept them alive. Amid this slow disintegration, new centers of power emerged. In the fertile valleys of Karaman, a Turkic family gathered nomadic clans beneath its banner and began to act in the Sultan's name without waiting for permission. To the north, the Gurmeyanids knit together market towns and fortresses with marriage alliances and trade. Along the southern coast, Menteşe and Aden established maritime principalities, equipping small fleets that preyed on Christian and Muslim shipping alike. None claimed independence outright. Each paid token homage to Konya and the Ilkhanids, while governing as they pleased. Urban life adapted to this new order with remarkable agility. The caravans still moved, though their guards now swore loyalty to local lords instead of royal inspectors. Inns and caravanserais became the connective tissue of a fragmented world. Their keepers enforced a fragile peace. Merchants of every faith could sleep safely so long as tolls were paid. In these courtyards, Persian bankers negotiated with Armenian jewelers and Greek shipmasters. Trade, not loyalty, held Anatolia together. Cultural life, too, shifted away from courts toward communities. The great scholars of Kekubad's time were gone, but their students spread their learning into smaller towns. Dervish lodges multiplied across the interior, humble buildings of clay and timber that replaced palaces as centers of meaning. There, wandering mystics preached endurance and humility in the face of loss. Among them, a few poets began to speak in the Turkish tongue, rather than the polished Persian of the elite. Language itself was changing. finding new rhythms for a humbler age. Konya remained the nominal heart of the Sultanate, but its grandeur now felt like the echo of another century. Sultans came and went, some barely crowned before dying, others ruling in name, while viziers and Mongol envoys managed reality. Taxes increased, confidence waned, and each crisis produced a smaller solution. Yet the city refused to decay entirely. Its craftsmen continued to tile domes and carve marble portals. Its scholars copied manuscripts in fine script. Civilization did not vanish. It simply lowered its voice. The Ilkhanid overlords preferred stability to innovation. As long as the tribute caravans arrived, they interfered little in domestic matters. Their officials demanded accounts and reports, but rarely imposed new laws. Over time, the Mongol administration itself began to rely on local intermediaries, Turkish notables who understood the land and its people. In this way, foreign dominion paradoxically prepared the ground for local autonomy. Authority filtered downward until it rested in the hands of provincial governors and frontier chieftains who no longer remembered asking permission. By the late 1200s, Anatolia had transformed into a mosaic of beyliks, small principalities that rose and fell with the fortunes of their founders. Each minted its own coinage, maintained its own army, and governed its own corner of the old Seljuk realm. Some were little more than fortified towns surrounded by farmland. Others commanded entire provinces. The beys fought one another as often as they fought outsiders, but their rivalries also spurred growth. Competition built cities, fortified ports, and funded mosques that rivaled those of the old empire. Among these rising powers, one remained almost invisible. In the wooded valleys near the Sakarya River, a modest chieftain named Osman, son of Ertugrul, commanded a few hundred warriors. His territory was a frontier buffer between Byzantium and the declining beyliks of the west, a marginal land of raids and truces. What set Osman apart was not strength but restraint. He fought carefully, settled disputes fairly, and rewarded loyalty with generosity. While greater houses exhausted themselves in endless quarrels, his small principality learned the art of patience. By the closing years of the century, Mongol authority in Anatolia had begun to fade. The Ilkhanate, stretched across 3 continents, struggled with its own civil wars and religious divisions. Tribute became irregular. The envoys arrived less frequently. Without a strong hand above them, the beyliks turned fully autonomous. The title of Sultan of Rum survived in the prayers of Konya's mosques, but its holder possessed little more than ceremony. Even in decline, the Seljuk heritage endured. The caravanserais still lined the trade routes, their arches bearing inscriptions commissioned in stronger times. The madrasas continued to teach the law of Malik Shah's era. The architecture, administration, and ideals forged by the Seljuks had become the grammar of Anatolian civilization. Every new ruler, however humble, spoke that language. When night fell over the plateau, lights gleamed from dozens of small courts, each a fragment of the old order, each imagining itself the center of renewal. Traders and mystics moved among them, carrying stories of unity lost and perhaps to be regained. Out of this scatter of ambitions, one would soon gather enough force to reimagine the world. But for now, Anatolia remained a quilt of sovereignties stitched together by shared memory and quiet endurance. The Seljuk name, once uttered with fear and awe, had become an inheritance rather than a power. A word spoken by poets, a model preserved by bureaucrats, a shadow cast by vanished greatness. Yet in that shadow, the foundations of a new empire were already forming. In the first years of the 14th century, the Seljuk sultans of Rum still held their court in Konya, but the throne had become a prop rather than a seat of power. Courtiers repeated ceremonies they no longer believed in, and scribes continued to write decrees for provinces that no longer obeyed. The walls of the city gleamed with tiles laid in the age of Kaikubad, yet the spirit that had raised them was gone. What remained was a graceful shell, a capital without a kingdom. The last sultans were children, pensioners of the Ilkhanid Mongols, protected and watched by foreign envoys who dictated their policies. Real decisions passed through the hands of viziers who learned to read the winds from Tabriz. Each new ruler was crowned with borrowed legitimacy, then quietly retired when the tribute faltered. The once mighty sultanate had become a pageant of succession, its grandeur preserved by habit and nostalgia. Outside the palace, history had already moved on. The beyliks that had emerged during the previous generation continued to grow in confidence and reach. In the central plateau, Karaman asserted dominance over Konya itself, styling its ruler as champion of the Turkish language and inheritor of Seljuk virtue. To the north, Jermian ruled prosperous towns linked by trade and intermarriage. Along the coasts, Aden, Menteşe, and Saruhan launched fleets that raided islands and trafficked goods with Genoa and Venice. Between these shifting powers lay the frontier, the UC, a borderland where faith, ambition, and necessity blurred. There, small warlords built their reputations through constant struggle with the Byzantine remnants to the west. Among these frontier lords was Osman, son of Ertugrul, whose tiny principality in Bithynia bordered Byzantine Bithynian and Nicaea. His soldiers were few, his fortresses modest, but the loyalty of his followers ran deep. What the Seljuks had once achieved through armies, Osman would begin through resilience and purpose. Konya, meanwhile, entered its twilight with dignity. The markets still thrived, artisans still tiled their mosques, and scholars still taught in the shadow of Nizam al-Mulk's old philosophy. But the city's rulers could no longer command even their neighbors. When Mongol tax collectors ceased to appear, local emirs assumed their duties, gathering revenues to pay their own troops. The machinery of empire survived only by being repurposed. In 1308, Sultan Masud II died, the last Seljuk ruler recognized even nominally across Anatolia. His death went unmarked by ceremony. No armies marched, no successor was proclaimed. The Mongols, absorbed in their own civil wars, sent no replacement. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, Anatolia had no central authority to invoke the name of Seljuk. The line that began with the steppe chieftain, Seljuk ibn Dukak, ended not in battle but in silence. Across the peninsula, the new lords understood what this meant. Independence was now a fact rather than a claim. In Karaman, the emir's scribes drafted decrees in Turkish instead of Persian, declaring it the language of sovereignty. In Aden and Menteşe, shipwrights worked under the crescent banner alone, unburdened by distant allegiances. In Osman's frontier domain, Ghazi warriors, fighters for faith and fortune, gathered around their chieftain with a sense of destiny. The transformation of Anatolia was complete. The land that had once formed a single sultanate was now a web of autonomous polities, each reflecting a different inheritance of the Seljuk age. The beyliks carried forward the institutions, architecture, and administrative habits of their predecessors, but their energy was new, restless, local, and adaptive. In their small courts, justice was swift, alliances personal, and loyalty measured in victory rather than bloodline. Konya remained a pilgrimage of memory. travelers still visited the tombs of old sultans and poets, and the city's dervish lodges became sanctuaries for those seeking spiritual rather than political meaning. Here, Jalal-ad-Din Rumi's followers transformed his teachings into a living tradition. The whirling of the Mevlevi dervishes, graceful and measured, seemed to echo the vanished rhythm of empire, turning yet never-ending. Through them, the Seljuk capital became a spiritual center, even as its political voice faded. The Ilkhanid presence, which had long shaped Anatolia's fortunes, also waned. Internal conflict within the Mongol Empire eroded their reach. Governors withdrew to Persia, and tributes ceased. Without the distant overlords to sustain it, the last threads connecting Konya to the great networks of the East frayed. The old Seljuk administrative families, now without masters, offered their talents to the rising beys. In this quiet migration of minds and skills, the culture of the empire found its next hosts. Along the western frontier, Osman's principality grew almost unnoticed. Byzantine garrisons, weakened by neglect, offered little resistance. His warriors took forts one by one, converting churches into mosques, renaming valleys, and granting land to settlers. Chroniclers would later see in these small conquests the first tremors of a new power, the Ottoman state. But at the time, they seemed like one more chapter in the endless rhythm of Anatolia's frontier wars. By the second decade of the century, the Seljuk legacy had scattered across time, like the tiles of its fallen palaces. Yet its imprint remained everywhere. The domed mosques, the geometric carvings, the caravanserais along the trade roads, all spoke of a civilization that had once turned the wilderness into order. Its language, its administration, and its architecture survived in the work of the very beys who had replaced it. The Seljuks had vanished, but their idea of rule, disciplined, cultured, and devout, endured. From the vantage of later generations, the end of the Seljuk line was not extinction, but transference. Power shifted west, finding new vessels in smaller, hungrier states. The Ottomans would claim descent from the Seljuks of Rum. The bureaucrats of Karaman would draft edicts in imitation of Isfahan's chancery. Even the poets of Germian would rhyme their verses to the cadences of Persian masters, once patronized by Malik Shah. In this way, the Seljuk world continued, not as empire, but as inheritance. When twilight fell over Konya's plain, the wind carried the scent of wheat and dust through the open arches of its ruined palaces. The banners had been lowered, the titles forgotten, but the rhythm of civilization they had set in motion endured. Out of the wreckage of their dominion, new powers would rise, carrying forward the memory of the steppe and the city, the balance between movement and permanence that had defined the Seljuk spirit. Their sun had set, yet its afterglow still lingered across Anatolia, illuminating the path of those who would come next. The age of the Seljuks was over. The age of the Ottomans was already dawning. Centuries passed, yet the imprint of the Seljuks remained like the pattern beneath a faded carpet, half hidden, never erased. Their empire had vanished, their line extinguished, but the architecture of their world endured in stone, language, and faith. Long after the banners of Konya and Isfahan had fallen, travelers crossing Anatolia still sheltered in caravanserais, built under Malik Shah and Kaikubad, their arches intact against the wind. What the sword could not preserve, habit and beauty did. Seljuk governance had been more than conquest. It was an experiment in order. From the steppes, they carried the discipline of the tent, hierarchy, loyalty, mobility, and grafted it onto the Persian ideal of administration. The result was a fusion that outlived both its parents. A state flexible enough to command nomads, stable enough to manage cities. Every dynasty that followed in the Islamic world inherited that model. When Ottoman scribes later drafted their first decrees, they used formulas devised by Nizam al-Mulk. When their architects designed domes and courtyards, they followed proportions refined in Seljuk mosques. The body of empire changed, but its skeleton remained the same. Even language bore their mark. Turkish, once the tongue of warriors and shepherds, became a language of law and poetry under their rule. Persian lent it grace, Arabic lent it learning. Together they created a triad that shaped the culture of the Middle East for centuries. The Seljuks never imposed their speech by decree, yet through patronage and education, they allowed it to grow from vernacular to vehicle of power. The letters carved into the stone portals of Anatolia's mosques and schools became symbols of that linguistic transformation, austere, balanced, enduring. Faith, too, acquired new dimensions under their protection. The Seljuk age restored Sunni Islam to political preeminence after centuries of division. Their patronage of the Nizamiya schools anchored religious education in law and philosophy rather than dogma. From those academies emerged thinkers who defined the theology of the next half-millennium. Al-Ghazali, with his synthesis of reason and revelation. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, with his intricate commentaries. In their classrooms, faith became a discipline of mind as much as of heart. Yet the Seljuk legacy was not limited to orthodoxy. Alongside the jurists and theologians flourished the mystics, ascetics and poets who sought the divine through experience rather than argument. Their rise was no accident. The disruption of conquest, the displacement of tribes, and the collapse of certainties created a hunger for inward stability. In Anatolia, that hunger found its voice in Jalal ad-Din Rumi. Born into the fading brilliance of the empire, he transformed its loss into vision. His verses turned exile into devotion, impermanence into revelation. The whirling dervishes of Konya, moving in circles beneath domes the Seljuks had built, carried forward not merely a religion, but a rhythm, the turning of worlds within worlds. Architecture embodied this same balance between movement and rest. In their buildings, geometry became a theology of endurance. Caravanserais like Sultan Han or Zazuddin Han were fortresses of peace, protecting merchants as empires rose and fell. Their walls combined Persian symmetry, Turkic sturdiness, and Byzantine masonry, each block a treaty between civilizations. The mosques of Isfahan, Sivas, and Konya translated the vastness of the steppe into stone. Their domes mirrored the sky under which the Seljuks had first learned freedom. Even the modest village schools and tomb towers carried this sense of measured grace, the confidence that faith could be built, not only believed. Their artistic sensibility reached beyond ornament into meaning. The Seljuks favored restraint over excess, repetition over novelty. Patterns unfolded like prayers. A single motif turned again and again, revealing infinite variation within unity. This aesthetic discipline became the signature of Islamic art from Cairo to Samarkand. To build as the Seljuks built was to acknowledge the divine in precision, the same belief that guided their astronomers and mathematicians. Their influence crossed frontiers they never conquered. In the Crusader states, Latin chroniclers wrote admiringly of their discipline and law. In Byzantium, craftsmen adopted Seljuk tilework and metal inlay. In the east, the Mongols employed former Seljuk architects to raise their own capitals. The world that had feared their armies soon borrowed their artisans. Even as conquerors vanished, their builders and scholars remained indispensable. If their political unity dissolved, their administrative genius survived intact. The system of Ikkutai land grants, refined under Malik Shah, shaped fiscal policy across the Islamic world. It provided the financial backbone for armies, the stability of rural life, and the link between soldier and state. Later rulers inherited not only its mechanism, but its philosophy. The belief that good governance required balance between nomad and city, frontier and center. That balance became the secret of the Ottoman centuries to come. In the quiet centuries that followed their fall, the Seljuks became less a dynasty than a memory of ideal rule. Chroniclers portrayed them as just kings, protectors of scholars, and champions of Islam's unity. Their faults were softened by time, their divisions forgotten. To recall their empire was to remember a moment when order seemed possible, when law, art, and faith spoke the same language. That memory outlasted its truth, yet it gave coherence to the centuries that followed. Theirs was also a spiritual legacy of paradox. They began as steppe warriors who believed destiny rode on horseback, yet ended as patrons of libraries and observatories. They arrived with the restlessness of nomads and departed leaving cities that stood for stability. In their journey from tent to dome, they carried with them the conviction that motion and order were not enemies but reflections, that the world's constant change could itself be a form of permanence. By the early 14th century, as Anatolia splintered into beyliks and the Mongol yoke faded, the Seljuk world seemed a vanished constellation, yet its light continued to travel. The Ottomans, who rose from one of those frontier provinces, inherited not only their administrative patterns, but their imagination. The idea that empire was not simply territory, but a way of organizing meaning. Through them, the Seljuk synthesis of Turkic vigor, Persian intellect, and Islamic devotion found new expression on a larger stage. When scholars later traced the genealogy of civilization across the Middle East, they found the Seljuks everywhere, in the arches of mosques, in the formulas of government, in the verses of poets, and in the whispered prayers of wandering dervishes. They were not remembered for a single battle or monument, but for the invisible framework they left behind, the grammar of empire itself. Their story ended in dissolution, yet dissolution proved not to be death, but diffusion. Ideas scattered with the winds of history, taking root in new soils. The caravanserais they built still stand, their stones warm with the light of morning, reminding travelers that even empires can leave hospitality as their final gift. And so the Seljuks passed from rulers to ancestors, from ancestors to legend, and from legend to foundation. The steppe that birthed them returned to silence, but the world they shaped continued to speak, in domes that mirrored the sky, in verses that sought the eternal, and in the enduring belief that faith and order, once joined, could outlast the hand that forged them.